And what memories do you have of your dad who died when you were a little kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old?
That's right. Yeah. What memories do I have? I mean, they just flood, and they're remarkable and many and varied. And of course, my father was at the time rising up the ranks of the Scottish trade union movement. So there's actually been little bits and pieces that you can read in newspapers, in books, in history of the labour movements, the history, for example, the Transport and General Workers Union. I was able to kind of piece together things that I hadn't fully understood. And quite recently, actually, I was given access. One of his closest friends passed away recently, and rather kindly, as he was kind of preparing for his own death, he was getting his, what they always say, getting his papers in order and that. And what he did was he put an envelope full of photographs and clippings of my dad and sent them to Off the Ball. So I was able to kind of piece together quite a lot of his early life, things that I didn't really understand at the time, but was able to make greater sense of them since. And one of the things that really kind of was remarkable for me was that I hadn't really fully understood the events of the day that he died. He died in a small Perthshire village called Ailith, which is on a back road from Perth up towards Forfar, where he was going, where there was an industrial dispute within a haulage company, and he was the district secretary for Perth and Dundee. So he went up. His members were on strike, and he was going up to offer his support to them. And a car that he had broken down, so he'd flagged a lift off a lorry. He tended to know all the lorry drivers. They were all his members. And a guy from Aberdeen had stopped for him, and on the way up towards Forfar, the tyre had blown out in the lorry. It veered off the road and hit a tree, and that my father died instantly, and the lorry driver survived. A few years later, I remember hearing this noise down in the front room of my house, and it was like a wild animal, almost like a kind of dog screeching. And I went down, and I kind of tiptoed down, and I could see through the door that this grown man, literally on the floor, on all fours, almost begging forgiveness from my mum. And what it was the lorry driver had driven down from Aberdeen to speak to my mum and literally seek her forgiveness. And it's quite an extraordinary scene, because clearly for that man it had hurt his life, harmed his life in ways that we will never know. I still to this day don't know who the man was. He'll have long since passed now. But if his family's out there, he clearly was a man with some dignity, you know.
Yes.
So that was kind of my dad passing away.
What a trauma for your mum and for you. Do you recall? And I'm sure you do, the moment when this terrible news was broken to you, where you were, what you were doing.
I was in the front room at home, and I can remember almost every part of a kind of drama that unfolded. There was actually a comedy kind of animation at the time called Pinky and Perky. They were two little kind of pigs, and Pinky and Perky was on the TV, and we were watching that, and someone came to the door. Now, this is the kind of thing that to this day would kind of devastate you if you were a young local journalist. The door went, and it was a guy from the Perthshire Advertiser, our local newspaper, looking effectively for a quote from my mother or comments or a family photograph for the next day's paper. And he had got there before the police, just purely by circumstantial chance. And he realised when he knocked on the door that my mum had no idea what had happened, and he broke the news to her. And I heard my mum weeping in the kitchen and went through. And my mum told me a very kind of comforting lie. I said, "Is Daddy dead?" And she said, "No, but I think he's very ill, but he's still with us." And by that time, he was dead. But there was a way where she was trying to find a way to let me down gently. And this was the way. So the circumstances were quite odd and quite dramatic. And then he had been out in the Soviet Union. He'd been out in Russia, actually, not long after the Yuri Gagarin had arrived back from his space mission. And he had had the privilege of meeting Yuri Gagarin, who at the time was probably the biggest national hero in Soviet history. And he'd been taken to the front of the queue to meet this guy by trade unionists in Moscow and Kiev. And Yuri Gagarin had said to him in kind of broken English that he'd studied Robert Burns at primary school, and then started to kind of recite a little bit of To a Field Mouse to my dad. So my dad the next day thought, oh, I'll send Stuart a postcard. And the postcard was a framed portrait, a portrait of black and white portrait of Yuri Gagarin. And he put on the back, I met the famous Yuri Gagarin today. See you soon, son. Love, Dad. And of course, the postcard arrived after he died. So I've got very kind of bittersweet memories of it. But of course, the greatest thing of all was he bequeathed in me a great kind of love of many, many things, not least social change. And of course, the darlings that are St Johnstone Football Club.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, Stuart, your dad sounds a fascinating and brilliant guy. I'm wondering in what way this tragedy shaped your life or changed your life or in any way altered who you were or what became of you.
Well, very directly, I can answer that, Graham. What happened was that my father was rising very kind of swiftly through the ranks of the trade union movement. He was in a trade union called the Scottish Horse and Motormen's Association. It was a period of time when hauliers were still, for example, there was still horse and carts. The union was known as the Carters Union, but also heavy goods vehicles were coming in as well. And so he was rising up the ranks of the union, and the union had given him another job. He was district secretary for Perth and Dundee, and they'd given him a job which was going to be much broader for the whole of central Scotland, and that was going to require him to move to Glasgow. They had offices up in Hope Street in Glasgow, and he had actually taken that job and my mother and him were in the very early conversations of having to think about moving to Glasgow and having a home there and building their life there, which is kind of painful in a way because it didn't happen. Thank God, because I would be forever asking the question, but who would you really have chosen to support,
I was going to say, Cosy, you would have been a Ouija.
Exactly, and that would have been one of the most painful things that would have happened to me, because you know what, Graham, it would have stripped away about 30% of my shtick.
Absolutely. It would have pulled the rug from under you.
Absolutely, and you'd be scrabbling around in 60s Scotland and getting caught up in all the nonsense there with no moral high ground. You would have had to decide,